5 o'clock, June 22, 1944. The forest is still wet from night rain. Pine needles cling to boots. A low mist hangs over the Belarusian lowlands, cold enough to bite bare skin. Somewhere in the darkness, engines idle, then fall silent. A German general lifts his field glasses, but before he can focus, the air itself begins to scream. Not artillery whistles, not shells, something else. A rising howl, mechanical, unnatural, as if the sky has torn open. The first rockets arrive not one by one, but together. Dozens, then hundreds. The ground convulses. Earth jumps into the air. The smell of burning cordite and wet soil slams into the lungs. Men are thrown flat before they even understand they are under fire. In seconds, the forest ahead vanishes behind walls of flame and dirt. This is not a barrage meant to warn. It is meant to erase. For the German commander watching from the rear slope, binoculars pressed hard against his face, the front line simply disappears. Not retreats. Not breaks. Disappears. What he is witnessing is the opening blow of Operation Bagration, the largest and most devastating Soviet offensive of the Second World War. And the weapon doing the damage is not a tank. Not an aircraft. It is massed rocket artillery, BM-13 Katyusha launchers, firing in coordinated salvos with a precision and scale the Wehrmacht has never faced before. The rockets land in under 20 seconds. The screaming stops. The explosions continue. Then, suddenly, silence returns, thick, unnatural, broken only by fires crackling where trenches used to be. The general lowers his glasses. There is nothing left to command. For 3 years on the Eastern Front, German officers had learned to read artillery fire. The spacing of shells, the rhythm of guns, the time available to move men. Katyusha rockets shattered all of that experience. They arrived too fast, too loud, too concentrated. German war diaries describe the effect repeatedly, using the same words again and again. Shock, panic, collapse. The Soviets called it rocket artillery. German soldiers called it Stalin's organ, because of the terrifying howl the rockets made as they launched. The sound came first, not as a warning, but as a weapon in itself. Each BM-13 launcher carried 16 rockets. A single battery could fire an entire load in under 10 seconds. On this morning in June 1944, multiple batteries fired together. Over 50 launchers, according to Soviet operational records, blanketing German defensive sectors with hundreds of high-explosive rockets in a single opening strike. This was not random fire. By 1944, the Red Army had mastered deep artillery preparation, using aerial reconnaissance, partisan intelligence, and weeks of planning. German positions were mapped. Command posts identified. Communications hubs marked for destruction. When the rockets came down, they hit exactly where German doctrine depended most on order and control. The battalion being watched through those binoculars was not a rear-line unit. It was an experienced formation. Men who had survived years of fighting in the East. They had dug in properly. They had camouflage. They had discipline. None of it mattered. Katyusha rockets did not need pinpoint accuracy. Their purpose was saturation. Overpressure collapsed trenches. Shrapnel shredded radio wires. Explosions buried machine gun nests alive. Officers were killed before they could give orders. Survivors were often deaf, concussed, unable to stand. German after-action reports from Bagration describe entire forward companies rendered Kampfunfähig, combat ineffective, within minutes, even when casualties were not total. A battalion did not need to be annihilated to vanish. It only needed to lose cohesion. That is what the general was seeing. A unit still alive on paper, but gone in reality. Operation Bagration was launched on the 3rd anniversary of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. The symbolism was deliberate. So was the brutality. The Red Army committed over 2 million men, thousands of tanks, and the heaviest concentration of artillery in its history. Rocket launchers played a specific role. Unlike conventional guns, Katyushas were used for sudden, overwhelming strikes at the exact moment of attack. They fired, relocated immediately, and avoided counter-battery fire. German intelligence had identified the weapon years earlier, but by 1944, its scale of deployment had multiplied far beyond expectations. German generals understood what was happening too late. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding Army Group Center, believed Soviet attacks would be limited. He underestimated both their strength and their coordination. When the rockets opened fire across multiple sectors simultaneously, German reserves had nowhere to go. Roads were already under bombardment. Communications were severed in the first minutes. From command posts miles behind the front, officers watched maps become meaningless. The line was not bending. It was dissolving. German soldiers who survived the initial strikes described a strange sensation, the feeling that the world had ended and restarted in seconds. One veteran later wrote that after a Katyusha barrage, time itself seemed broken. That psychological impact was not accidental. Soviet artillery doctrine by 1944 emphasized moral destruction as much as physical damage. Fear was multiplied by unpredictability. The rockets did not fall evenly. Some areas were obliterated, others spared. Survivors never knew why. And for the men watching from behind, the generals, staff officers, liaison units, the uncertainty was just as deadly. Reports stopped coming in. Units failed to answer roll calls. Entire battalions became question marks. One of those question marks lay directly in front of the binoculars that morning. A formation that had existed at 4:59 was gone by 5:01. As Soviet infantry and armor began moving forward through the smoke, they did not encounter a fighting line. They encountered wreckage, cratered earth, abandoned weapons, men stumbling back without helmets, without rifles, without orders. German doctrine relied on counterattacks to restore broken fronts. But counterattacks require leadership, radios, organization. Katyusha fire removed all three in moments. By midday on June 22, 1944, multiple German divisions were already fragmented. By nightfall, Army Group Center was fatally compromised. Yet standing there in the early morning mist, the German general could not yet see the full catastrophe. He only knew that one of his best units had ceased to exist as a fighting force before it ever saw the enemy. No warning, no chance to react, no defense. And as the smoke drifted and the echoes faded, a terrifying realization began to take shape. If this was only the opening strike, what was still coming? The rockets had stopped, but the offensive had just begun. As the smoke thinned, reality returned in fragments. Burning trees, overturned guns, men moving without direction. Soviet assault infantry advanced cautiously at first, weapons raised, expecting resistance that never came. What they found instead were positions that looked intact from a distance but were dead up close. Trenches collapsed inward like graves. Dugouts crushed by overpressure. Radios melted into the earth. Rifles abandoned where hands had once held them. German doctrine relied on elastic defense, absorbing blows, then counterattacking with reserves. But Katyusha fire was designed to kill elasticity itself. The rocket struck command nodes first, not by chance, but by planning. Soviet fire tables prioritized known headquarters, signal junctions, and road intersections. Once those were destroyed, the front became blind. This was not improvisation. It was industrialized destruction. By 1944, the Red Army had reorganized its artillery into specialized rocket regiments. Katyusha launchers were grouped, masked, and protected by conventional guns. Each salvo was timed to the second. Soviet manuals emphasized speed. Fire, relocate, fire again. German counter-battery crews often aimed at empty ground. Meanwhile, chaos spread behind the German lines. Surviving officers attempted to gather men, but ranks were broken. Platoons mixed with other units. Maps no longer matched terrain. A battalion that had vanished in the morning now reappeared in fragments. 20 men here, 10 there, none able to fight as a unit. German after-action reports from Army Group Center repeatedly described the same pattern. Rocket fire followed immediately by infantry infiltration and armored breakthroughs. There was no pause to regroup. No time to breathe. The Soviet attack rolled forward like a tide that could not be stemmed. Inside German command posts, the psychological pressure was relentless. Staff officers struggled to make sense of reports that contradicted each other. Some units claimed to be holding. Others claimed to be destroyed. Telephone lines were dead. Runners were killed on roads swept by artillery. One German Corps diary from June 1944 notes that entire defensive sectors ceased reporting within minutes. Not hours. Minutes. This was the moment many German generals realized something fundamental had changed. Earlier in the war, Soviet artillery had been heavy but clumsy. By 1944, it was precise in purpose if not in aim. The goal was no longer attrition alone. It was paralysis. Katyusha rockets played a unique role in that paralysis. Technically, they were inaccurate compared to guns. But accuracy was irrelevant when hundreds of rockets saturated an area the size of several football fields. The blast effects overlapped. Shock waves compounded. Survivors described feeling as if their organs had shifted inside their bodies. Medical reports later recorded widespread concussion injuries without visible wounds. Men who could still walk could not fight. For the German general watching his front dissolve, the most frightening realization was not the loss of one battalion. It was the pattern. Reports from neighboring sectors confirmed the same thing. Massed rocket fire, silence, then collapse. This was happening everywhere. Operation Bag Ration was unfolding not as a single breakthrough, but as dozens of simultaneous ruptures. German reserves were insufficient. When they moved into fire. Soviet air superiority ensured roads were death traps by daylight. The elite formations the Wehrmacht relied on, experienced infantry divisions hardened by years of war, were being dismantled before they could engage. Not defeated in battle. Neutralized before battle. German generals had prepared for tanks, for aircraft, for artillery. But the speed and psychological violence of Katyusha salvos created a battlefield where decision-making lagged behind destruction. By the second day of the offensive, entire German corps were encircled or retreating without orders. The word breakthrough no longer applied. This was collapse. And still, the rockets kept coming. From the Soviet perspective, the success was staggering, but costly. Katyusha units were high-priority targets. Crews operated under strict discipline. Launch sites were camouflaged. Orders were simple and unforgiving. Fire and move immediately. Any delay invited annihilation. Rocket crews often worked under intense stress. The launch itself shook the trucks violently. Flames washed over the rails. The noise was deafening even for those firing the weapons. Yet morale was high. Soldiers knew the effect their rockets had. They could see the fear they caused from kilometers away. Soviet veterans later recalled watching German prisoners after Katyusha strikes. Men shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak, eyes unfocused. These were not raw recruits. These were survivors of Stalingrad, Kursk, years of brutal fighting. Something had broken them. As June turned into July, Army Group Center ceased to exist as a coherent force. Over 300,000 German troops were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions were erased from the order of battle. It was the worst defeat in German military history. And it began, for many units, with that first sound. The howl. The rockets. The silence afterward. For the general who had watched his battalion vanish, the days that followed offered no relief. Each new defensive line was thinner than the last. Each new position lacked men, guns, confidence. The war had changed shape. What once felt like a grinding struggle now felt inevitable. And as Soviet forces pushed westward, liberating cities and destroying what remained of German resistance, a final question began to haunt those who survived the opening strikes. If an army could be shattered in minutes, what did courage, experience, or discipline even mean anymore? The answer would come not in theory, but in the final months of the war, when the same weapons that erased battalions would help decide the fate of Europe itself. By mid-July 1944, the remnants of Army Group Center were no longer recognizable as the units that had marched into Belarus just weeks earlier. Entire divisions were reduced to scattered companies. Supply lines collapsed. Command structures were shattered. And all of it had begun with the sound of rockets. A sound that seemed almost alive, like a predator announcing its presence before the strike. The German general who had watched his battalion vanish now understood the full scale of what had occurred. It was not just one unit lost. It was the illusion of control itself that had been destroyed. Men trained for years, hardened by battles from Leningrad to Stalingrad, were unable to operate under the new reality. Leadership had become a fragile concept. Courage alone could no longer hold a line against industrialized destruction. Yet amidst the devastation, there were acts of extraordinary human endurance. Small pockets of soldiers, cut off from their units, managed to regroup, organize ad hoc defenses, and survive against overwhelming odds. A lieutenant documented how, after losing his company headquarters, he gathered 7 men and held a bridge against repeated Soviet attempts to cross. Their rifles cracked, their ammunition dwindled, but they endured. These stories illustrate the duality of the battlefield, the sheer technological might of modern warfare versus the resilience of individuals. The Katyusha rockets had erased formations, but they could not erase courage entirely. They reshaped the battlefield and the psychology of warfare, forcing armies to adapt or perish. For the German general, survival was bitter. Decisions he had made, based on experience, were now irrelevant. Maps were obsolete within minutes. Orders delayed by seconds became deadly mistakes. The army he commanded had become vulnerable to a new form of warfare, mechanized, coordinated, and psychologically overwhelming. He had witnessed firsthand that technological innovation could redefine strategy and mortality on a scale previously unimaginable. Historians analyzing the aftermath of Operation Bagration note that the rapid collapse of German defenses was not purely due to numerical superiority. It was a combination of strategy, timing, and weaponry. Rocket artillery did not simply kill, it dismantled structure, communication, and morale. It forced the Wehrmacht into reactive positions, where every movement risked annihilation. As the Red Army pressed west, the psychological imprint of the rocket barrages lingered. Soldiers recounted nightmares of flaming skies and the deafening wail of ordnance. Veterans who survived the initial strikes often spoke of the eerie calm that followed, the silence filled with tension. It was in that silence that fear took root, and with it, the understanding that the battlefield had evolved beyond recognition. In retrospect, the events of those days serve as a testament to the changing nature of warfare. Operation Bagration demonstrated that strategy was no longer just about numbers and terrain. It was about information, coordination, and the ability to leverage new technologies effectively. The Katyusha rockets symbolized a paradigm shift. War had become instantaneous, brutal, and deeply psychological. As we reflect on that June morning in 1944, the vanishing of one elite battalion becomes more than a tactical anecdote. It is a lens into the human cost of innovation in war, the fragility of even the most disciplined formations, and the resilience required to endure in the face of overwhelming force. One moment, they existed. The next, they were scattered, buried in smoke, fire, and shock. Yet through it all, the stories of survival, courage, and adaptation emerge, reminders of the human spirit within mechanized destruction. Today, the lessons of that moment extend beyond history books. Military analysts study it to understand combined arms coordination. Psychologists explore it to understand trauma and resilience. Engineers study it to understand the integration of technology into human systems. And as we stand decades later, the echoes of those rockets remind us that war is never just about numbers. It is about people, their fears, their bravery, and their capacity to endure. For viewers, it is worth considering. When a single weapon system can erase an entire battalion in moments, what does that say about the nature of control, the limits of preparation, and the unpredictability of life itself? History records the weapons and the battles, but it is the human stories that endure, stories of shock, courage, and survival under fire. And so, the German general's experience is not just a footnote in Operation Bagration. It is a study in perspective. He witnessed the birth of a new era of warfare. He saw formations vanish, discipline crumble, and yet, he also saw fragments of courage survive amidst the ruins. It is a reminder that history is never static, that war evolves, and that humanity, resilient, frightened, and determined, remains at its center. As the smoke clears from the forests of Belarus and the sound of rockets fades into memory, we are left with a profound lesson. Innovation can destroy, but it also reveals the depth of human resilience. The battlefield of 1944 teaches us that technology may change the scale of destruction, but it cannot extinguish the spirit of those who fight, survive, and bear witness. Perhaps most importantly, it challenges us to reflect on modern conflicts. How do we understand courage and fear when weapons operate at speeds and scales our ancestors could scarcely imagine? How do we honor the human stories behind statistics and strategy? In remembering that early morning when 50 rockets opened fire, erasing an elite battalion, we do more than recount history. We connect with it. We feel it. And in doing so, we acknowledge the fragility, the power, and ultimately, the enduring resilience of the human experience in war.